Good morning, everyone. Can you all hear me? Okay. Okay, my name is Karen Nia. I'm a senior engineer with the State Water Resources Control Board working on the Bay Delta Plant update. And you guys are all here to learn about SacWAM. SacWAM stands for the Sacramento Water Allocation Model. It was developed in coordination with the Stockholm Environment Institute and board staff over a period of several years. And the board plans to use this model to help with the Phase 2 update of the Bay Delta Plan. We wanted to hold this workshop for you because the Delta Science Program is holding an independent review of SacWAM, culminating with a public workshop on Wednesday, October 19th. So we're providing this seminar in advance so that the public and other agencies can learn about the model. So in addition to what you will hear in the seminar, we've placed lots of information on our website, and Scott Laguerre will be letting you know where that website is located. We are also working on a draft scientific basis report for the Phase 2 update that will be out in the near future, and we will be providing opportunity for public comment through a separate notice at that time. So in addition to myself, we have several other water board staff working on Phase 2. Today you'll be hearing from Scott Laguerre, who will provide background on Phase 2 and how SacWAM output will be used within the Phase 2 update. The rest of the presentation will be provided by Chuck Young of Stockholm Environment Institute and Andy Draper of MWH. We do have a full agenda today, and there will be chances to ask questions. We will also provide Scott's contact information if you have any further questions about today's activities. So our agenda for today is up on the screen. And after let's see. So we're going through, I will be providing some logistics. Scott will be providing an overview of SacWAM and the Phase 2 update. Then Chuck and Andy will be going through an introduction to the WEAP software, followed by going through SacWAM itself, then a break, and then discussion of some base model performance. After lunch, those people who are registered for the hands-on training in the afternoon will have to go downstairs and check in and get a different badge because that session is in conference room 550. And we will have staff downstairs. You'll see them. They will be sitting at something like one of these things here, and I don't know the names of them. But they will register you, get you a different badge, and escort you up to the room. Let's see. Now I've got some housekeeping details. There is a drinking fountain and restrooms located out the doors to the back of the room. Go to the left and then go past the glass sculpture hanging from the ceiling. The drinking fountain and restrooms are located there on the right. Food service is available in the building on the first floor. Take the grand stairs to the first floor, and at the bottom of the stairs, stay to the right. We encourage recycling efforts in this building, and so look for the green and tan 3-in-1 containers located outside the doors at the back of the room to recycle your papers, cans, and bottles. If the fire alarm goes off, we may need to evacuate the building, so please look around and identify 2 exits closest to you. There's a couple back there. Please take your valuables with you and do not use the elevators. Go down the stairs. The relocation site is across the street at Cesar Chavez Park. And so now I will let Scott take over, and he'll provide an overview of SacWAM and how it fits in with Phase 2.
Good morning, everybody. My name is Scott Laguerre. I'm a senior engineer in the Division of Water Rights. And today I'm going to give you some background on our Bay Delta planning activities and the SacWAM model. Water quality control plans are the foundation for the protection of beneficial uses by the state and regional water boards. In the case of the Sacramento-San Joaquin Delta, it's known as the Bay Delta Plan. The Bay Delta Plan, like other water quality control plans, identify beneficial uses and define water quality objectives to protect those beneficial uses. They also include a program of implementation for the water board and other entities to implement these water quality objectives. And it also includes a program of monitoring and special studies to assess the effectiveness of the water quality objectives. Pursuant to state law, water quality control plans need to be reviewed periodically, and pursuant to federal law, water quality control plans need to be reviewed every 3 years. The Division of Water Rights is currently engaged in a phased process to update the Bay Delta Plan. The first phase involves tributaries to the San Joaquin River and the South Delta salinity, and the phase 2 is a comprehensive update of the rest of the water quality control plan. Phase 2 is focused primarily on fish and wildlife protection of beneficial uses. It includes potential new inflow requirements to the Sacramento River, its major tributaries, the Delta East Side tributaries, and interior flow requirements, where phase 1 again addresses Delta inflow from the San Joaquin River. Phase 2 also includes potential changes to Delta outflow requirements, potential new and modified interior Delta flow requirements, potential new flow objectives to protect temperature, and it will include monitoring and special studies program and a program of implementation. SacWAM has been developed for the phase 2 update as well as future Bay Delta planning activities. So what types of analyses would be required for phase 2? So for phase 2, the analyses will primarily involve range of regulatory requirements to increase stream flows, and then simulate changes in diversions and reservoir operations. And then while that may sound pretty simple, in the case of the Bay Delta, we have such a complex system of streams, reservoirs, and diversions, it gets complicated very quickly. Stream flow estimates will be used to inform various types of analyses as part of the State Water Board's assessment of potential alternative regulatory requirements, including estimates of flow conditions under a range of regulatory alternatives, estimates of changes in water diversions to evaluate impacts on agricultural resources, water suppliers, and groundwater, estimates of changes in reservoir storage to evaluate impacts on hydropower generation, recreation, fisheries, and water supply. And this tool will also be used to inform other analyses or models such as delta hydrodynamics models, temperature, and economic models. So with this general types of analyses for phase 2, we developed specific requirements in the tool itself. We needed a tool for phase 2 that can be used by State Water Board staff and others, something that was flexible to be used in future projects as well. We needed the ability to simulate State and Central Valley Water Project reservoirs and delta operations. We also needed the ability to simulate non-project reservoirs and operations on non-project tributaries. We needed to have the ability to simulate major upstream hydropower operations, including reservoir releases and interbasin transfers. And we needed to have the ability to expand for future use and future efforts. And lastly, we needed a model that was thoroughly documented with all the model inputs and model assumptions. So with this list of needs in a model for phase 2, we reviewed the previously available tools. The two previously available tools for use in large-scale Bay Delta planning efforts in the past include Calcium 2, developed by the Department of Water Resources and the Bureau of Reclamation, and the Central Valley Planning Area Model, developed for the California Water Plan update by DWR. Calcium 2 has a detailed representation of project operations. However, it has limited representation of non-project tributaries and operations on those tributaries. It's not considered to be user-friendly, and it's not well documented. And so for these reasons, it's not readily usable by state water board staff and others. The Central Valley Planning Area Model has a coarse representation of the entire Sacramento Valley. It includes representation of non-project tributaries. It also includes representation of upstream hydropower operations. It's considered to be user-friendly. However, it lacks sufficient detail on the valley floor and specifically of project operations. So after reviewing these available tools, we determined that neither of them would be directly applicable for the phase 2 update because of for various reasons. So we decided to embark on developing a new tool. However, we didn't have to reinvent the wheel. We were able to take portions from the Central Valley Planning Area Model, such as the upstream hydrology and representation of the upstream hydropower operations. We were able to take detailed project operations from Calcium 2, such as the Cooperative Operations Agreement, Dynamic Allocation Logic, and the delta salinity using the artificial neural network. We combined that with updated supply and demand data, as well as increased resolution on the valley floor. We incorporated those into the WEAP framework, which has a user-friendly interface and rapid scenario capabilities. And we developed what we've released as SacWAM Beta 0.2, which is a draft version of the model, which will be updated before use in phase 2. The domain of SacWAM includes the entire Sacramento region, hydrologic region, the upper Trinity River upstream of the Lewiston Gauge, the Delta East Side tributaries, including the Calaveras, Cosumnes, and Mokelumne. It includes the entire Sacramento, San Joaquin Delta, and the lower San Joaquin River downstream of Vernalis. It includes the Delta export pumps, the upper reaches of the California Aqueduct, the Delta Mendota Canal, and the San Luis Reservoir. We've produced a website where users can download the model and the documentation and also other related studies, and it'll be a place for people to stay up to date on events and other model releases. If you have any questions about the development of SacWAM, please email me. My email address is also on the SacWAM website. So while this release of SacWAM is an exciting milestone, we've been working on this project for a couple of years, we still have a long ways to go. First, we're going through an independent peer review with the Delta Science Program, for which Karen mentioned that there is a public workshop on October 19th here at the Cal EPA building. With input from people like you guys and the peer review panel, we will incorporate these changes and release SacWAM 1.0, which will then be used in the phase 2 process. Will be used in the working draft scientific basis report that Karen mentioned, and also phase 2 draft environmental document that will evaluate a broad range of alternatives through a public process. And the model will hopefully be continued to be enhanced and updated for many different projects for much time in the future. So this whole process, there will be many chances for public input, and I encourage you guys to dig into the model and let us know if you guys have comments or ways that you feel like it can be improved. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Chuck and Andy, who are going to give you guys a little bit more background on the WEAP platform and SacWAM itself.
Thank you, Scott. Can everyone hear me okay? Yep. Okay, so my name is Chuck Young, and I work at the Stockholm Environment Institute in Davis. And I just want to thank you all for being here. We've been working on this project for a little bit over 2 years, and it's really exciting to finally get to share it with the public. Before I get started, I want to acknowledge several groups. Andy and I will be talking about this model today, but of course it's been a large group of people who have actually worked on it. At the state board, of course, Karen and Scott and several others have been our collaborators. The prime contractor has been ICF International with Nicole Williams as the project manager. At MWH Global, we've had Andy Draper and Tom Fitzhugh helping us. And finally at SEI, or the Stockholm Environment Institute, where I work, myself, Brian Joyce, Jack Sieber, who's the programmer of the WEAP software, Ann Herford, and Elsa McCullough have all participated in this project. We'd also like to give a special thanks to the Bay Delta office for their support and help in providing data. Without that data, this model simply would not be possible. We also would like to thank Jim Beyer, who is the developer of the XA solver, which many of you are probably familiar with in working with CalSim, as he's been helpful in providing an XA solver that works well with this model. Okay, so what we'll cover today, or in the morning session, is an introduction to the WEAP software for those of you who aren't familiar with it. And then we'll go into a description of the SacWAM model itself. That should take us up to the break. Following the break, Andy's going to talk about the base model performance, and that should take us pretty close to lunchtime. So let's start with the WEAP software. What is the Water Evaluation and Planning System, or WEAP? Simply, it's a water resources planning tool. And at its most fundamental level, it's basically a comparison between supplies and demands. And it's a comparison both spatially and temporally. You can use the software to determine when shortages in supplies will occur and when unmet demands will occur. It accounts for storage both on the surface and also in the groundwater system. And a very important feature is that it allocates water during periods of shortage. It provides a way for users to specify the priorities that will be put on different demands. So it prioritizes where water should go during periods of shortage. And we're going to discuss that in more detail in the coming slides. WEAP has a comprehensive accounting of the water resources system. If the user chooses, you can represent the rainfall runoff processes, including snow melt and accumulation. You can represent infrastructure such as dams and diversions, canals, etc. It has the ability to represent operation rules. It can be programmed to represent operations rules. And a really key part of this is the model is very scalable. The model user or the model builder can decide what level of complexity is needed to represent a particular process in their system. For instance, as far as demands go, you can represent them as simply as a time series or a repeating monthly range of values, all the way up to a very complex plant growth model that takes into account climatic inputs as well as the CO2 concentration in the atmosphere. The objects that are used in WEAP have been pre-built, which greatly simplifies model construction and makes it a much faster process. One note I want to make here is there are several options for the simulation of groundwater. As you'll see in the coming slides, we've done a fairly simple representation in SacWAM, but we do have the capability in WEAP to interact with the ModFlow software. And an important note with this model is it does not simulate hydraulics. So it does not simulate the time it takes for water to travel down, say, from Shasta Dam to the delta. So that needs to be considered when you're designing the model. It has a flexible integration with other models through an API and through linking with DLLs. The interface is modifiable, so you can customize the model to suit your needs. And the WEAP software is under continuous development, and updates are provided automatically to the user community. We also have a training resources available on the web page, very well developed and used widely around the world set of tutorials. And then we also can provide on-site or online training upon request. Just to give you a sense of the scope of its use, you can see a figure here on the right. We can see where website visits have occurred in the past 2 years. There's about 78,000 unique website visits, and you can see they're spread across the globe. It's been under development for about 20 years now. The user forum, which I think several of you have joined just in the past few hours when downloading the software, is in excess of 22,000 members now. It's been used in hundreds of scientific publications. Okay. So now let's start to really look at the software in a bit more detail. It has a well-designed graphical user interface. You can see on the left side of your screen there are these buttons. One's called Schematic, and there's Data, Results, Scenario Explorer, and Notes. And those take you to different screens within the software where you can interact with the various aspects of your model. To the right of those buttons, we have the palette that is used in designing the schematic. And the objects on that palette are the things you'd expect, like reservoirs, rivers, demand sites, catchment nodes for representing hydrology, etc. Immediately below the palette is a list of the shape files and grid files that are displayed on the schematic. So that information can be brought in from a GIS and used to help the user in designing the schematic and situating it correctly. And then finally, at the bottom of that column of screens, we have a little window that's a second map that you can use for zooming around on the larger map. So in the schematic view, this is where you actually design the model itself. And for those of you who stick around for the afternoon session, you'll get a short example of this. Basically, you click and drag to create the schematics or the elements on the schematic, very similar to the type of interactions you have with GIS software. All the model parameters are easily accessed. You can right-click on schematic elements and quickly go into what we call the data tree, or you can click on the data button on the left side of the screen. And this brings up a tree of variables that you can quickly navigate through and quickly see the underlying information that are in the model. Those information then are displayed in chart form, as you can see here on the bottom right. Also can be displayed in tabular form, which helps in correcting errors and quality control in your model. When you're entering data, you can use a nice feature called the expression builder. This window that we see here at the bottom left of the screen pops up, and in it you have the ability to access various functions similar to the Excel functions that we use, as well as the entire data tree, which means you can access all the different variables within the model, and you can develop complex logic for, say, operations rules using this expression builder. Now let's talk a bit about the results view. There's many ways to look at results in the software. They can be shown as graphs, as you see here. They can also be shown in tabular form. And they can also be shown on a map. So what we see here is a map view of a stream and some diversions. And the stream flows for that particular time step are shown numerically, and the width of the stream and diversion arcs are a function of the volume of water flowing through them in that time step. So that can be a very useful feature for studying output from the model. There's also the feature of easily exporting results out to CSV or XLS files. We will soon have an export feature that goes to DSS files. You have a wide range of units that you can specify for the export and display of your data. And with single clicks, you can have annual totals and monthly averages, so you don't have to export out to Excel and calculate those. Those are rapidly calculated in the software itself. And finally, a very nice feature is what we call the result favorites. Pretty much it is what it sounds like. You design a particular view of the result that you would like, and then you can save that. And then you can run the model over and over and keep coming back to that favorite very quickly and seeing how the new data look. So for an example here would be if you pull up the time series of observed stream flows at a particular location and what the simulated flows are at that location, and then you can save that and then quickly return to that in the future as you run the model under different scenarios. Help is available. It does have a useful help screen. I know some software is a little less helpful than others, but our programmers worked hard at documenting the software itself. It has a table of contents for finding things, but it also has an index and a search function. So this is truly a helpful help screen, I find. Okay, so let's move over to talking about scenarios. This is a very important feature in the software. They're very easily created. With just a couple clicks in the interface, you can bring up the scenario manager here, and you can create a new scenario. And what that does is it basically creates a whole new copy of the parameters in the model. Then you can edit the parameters in any way you see fit to create your new scenario. And what you're seeing here on the screen, I think you can see it there. When the parameter is different in the scenario than it is in the underlying data or parent scenario, the values turn red. So that gives you a visual cue that you have a different value. So again, what it does is it creates a whole new set of parameters. It retains the original set, creates a new set for you. You can modify them. And then you can run the model using both sets of parameters, and you can compare the results within the software. So here we have an example where there were 4 scenarios, and we can see the 4 different plots, each plot representing a different scenario. Okay, now I'd like to talk about the water allocation routines just a bit, because that's a very important feature in this software, and particularly for the application that the board is creating here. The water allocation problem is solved within each time step. So it's not a problem that's solved across all time steps at once. It is solved within each time step. It's solved using a linear program. And the inputs that are provided to this process are user-assigned priorities on the demands. So you're basically ordering the demands per their priority, meaning the highest priority demands get water first. Then if there's enough water, the next in line in the priority structure would receive water. If a demand has more than one source of water, the user assigns preferences, meaning In this case, this example that I've shown here, this green square is meant to signify groundwater, and the preference is for the groundwater. So it uses the groundwater first, and then the diversions from the stream second. Let's go through a couple quick examples to bring that point home. The result, or the combination of the preferences and priorities results in an allocation order. And that's what's used in determining the number of runs of the LP that will be needed. So quick example here, and we have the same demand priorities on our two demands. We have this 40 unit demand, a 70 unit demand on the right. We have 100 units upstream in the river. When they have the same priority, what's going to happen is their needs will be met or reduced, I should say, by an equal percentage. So in this case, the 70 unit demand will get 63.6 units, and the 40 unit demand will get 36.4. And that's a 9% shortage for both. So again, if they have the same priority, they'll receive proportionally similar reduction in their deliveries. Now, in the case where the priorities are different, the example we have here is the 40 unit demand on the left is priority 1. The 70 unit demand on the right is priority 2. So the first thing that happens is the full 40 units go to the demand on the left. And then the remaining water, 60 units, goes to the demand on the right. That leaves 0 units going downstream. Here, what we have is a 14.2% shortage in the larger 70 unit demand. And here we have an example where we have different supply preferences. In this case, the large demand unit, the 70 unit demand, has a higher priority for river water, but it has a greater preference for groundwater. So as we go through our allocation process, it first takes 50 units from the groundwater to meet the 70 unit demand. Then, because it has the first priority on river water, it's next in line, and it takes 20 units to meet its full demand. And then the other demand takes its 40 units as a second priority on the river water, and that leaves 40 units traveling downstream. So that just gives you a quick overview of how the priority and preference schemes work. And if you're here in the afternoon, you'll get to play with that a bit in a model that you'll be constructing. Okay, now I want to talk about licensing. We've recently decided that if WEAP is being used to run SacWAM, then it will be provided for free. That's a change we have to make in the software, so it's not quite in place yet, but within a week or two we should have that available. That will be the case for all users except consultants. I've also put just for your reference, I've put the prices to university students and academic institutions and federal government and nonprofits if the software is being used for models other than SacWAM. It's worth noting here that the California public agencies are receiving the software for free in all cases. That's because of an agreement that we have with DWR that was developed when we started working on the water plan. I would like to note, though, the unlicensed version, which you can freely download from the web page, can be used to explore any model, including SacWAM, and it can also be used to run the model and modify it. You just can't save the changes. So that's the restriction if you don't have the license. The license is obtained by going through the WEAP webpage. I also need to note that the SacWAM model, being as complex as it is, requires the XA solver to have acceptable run times. So that would be an additional cost if your organization doesn't already own the XA solver. Here's the website. It's www.weep21.org. As I said, this is where you can go for licensing and downloads of the software. There's a very well-developed tutorial available on the web page that can be done individually. We also have training videos if that's how you prefer to learn about software. So I urge you to check out the website. So in summary, I'd like to say the WEAP software basically compares demands and supplies spatially and temporally. It combines both the hydrology and water management aspects of a water resources problem, and it allocates water during shortages. The software has a well-designed interface which provides a transparent data structure, and it has a very easy-to-use scenario capability. Okay, so I'd like to pause now and just see if there are any questions about the WEAP software before we continue on into talking about SacWAM itself. Yes? In our experience, that he has worked. Oh, sorry. The question was, is the XA solver used in SacWAM different from the XA used in CalSim? He has worked with our developer a bit to fine-tune the XA solver for SacWAM, but our experience has shown that using an older version that was used with CalSim seems to work as well. Yep, Russ?
Hi, Chuck. The idea of solving each month, I understand that that is the solution technique for lots of models. But you know, one of the fundamental things of reservoir operations is having some inkling of what your overall supply is, and you base your allocation on a seasonal supply. So I'm asking, what trick does WEAP use to incorporate a future forecast into the month-by-month allocation?
Sure. So there's probably many ways to approach that problem. One way is when calculating, say, an allocation, you pause at a certain time step in the year, say April. You look at reservoir storage at the end of March, and you can look forward on inflow time series. It has the ability to look forward on the inflow time series, or you can put in average time series and take an estimate of what you expect your inflows to be.
Do you need to work closely with the hydrologic model to account for timing and travel time?
Right. So I said earlier that it does not have the hydraulic simulation. So the trick with using a model like this is you need to use a time step that's long enough that the travel time is incorporated within that time step. Because the reality is in the model, if, say, flows come into Shasta Reservoir, it's possible they could be utilized all the way down in the delta within the same time step. So you wouldn't want to have an hourly time step because that's just physically not possible. And in designing the SacWAM, we've used a monthly time step. Mike, you need the microphone.
Okay, I can talk.
Well, he has to record it.
Oh, okay, sure. So have you ever used some sort of, parameter estimation technique to calibrate the model?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it has an interface to work with PEST, which probably many of you are familiar with, a parameter estimation software. However, I will say the interface, it just kind of gives you an ability to access a few of PEST's features, not all of them. But of course, you can work with something like PEST and develop, through the API, you can develop calls to WEAP and run it from a different program or from within PEST.
You showed how an equal priority would have a similar same percentage split Is it possible to do that in volume or flow to like the same CFS going two ways? Or is it just percentages?
Well, it works, it's the same percentage reduction, and you're asking could it have
Could
the-
you use the units instead of a percentage?
so you have the same, say, CFS going to each?
Right.
Not thinking of a way right now. Let me
Okay.
think
Just-
about that.
Thanks.
Yeah, ask me again afterwards, and probably think of a solution to that.
If down the road they wanted to go to a weekly time step, does the WEAP platform support that?
Yes, yes. You can go from a daily time step up to annually if you desire. But of course, you always need to keep track of the fact that it is not tracking the time it takes water to flow through the channels.
Hi, Chuck. I have a question related to calcium and this new model. So I think it's the first few slides you mentioned about the difference between these two. I think probably from your presentation. Yeah.
Right.
So it appears to me that the mechanism or the modeling principles are very much similar. You have to assign priorities to individual demands or supply, right? And then also you use linear programming to optimize this kind of process. So can you tell me a little bit more about those models, a difference between this?
How about Andy take a crack at that one?
So both models use mixed integer programming solver. They're both solving for one time step, but there's a very significant difference between the algorithm used within WEAP and that used within Calcium 2. In Calcium 2, you assign a weight structure so that there can be trade-off between different demands. So in the linear programming problem or the mixed integer programming problem, there may be a weight on storage, a weight on delta outflow, a weight on deliveries, and it is trading off those competing demands. What SacWAM does is it sequentially solves priority by priority. So imagine in Chuck's example, you had two priorities on two agricultural demands from a river. So in the first mixed integer programming problem, the model only sees the priority for one of those demand units or one of those agricultural demands, and it will assign all of the water as far as it can to meet that demand. Having solved that initial allocation problem, the model will add a constraint and say, in the second allocation, you have to maintain the delivery to the higher priority demand, and then you will assign all the remaining supplies to that second priority. So this sequential layering or solving of the problem is very different from a trade-off between competing demands. So really the weight structure of the linear program is very different.
Also, I want to follow up with a previous question about calibration. I understood that calcium cannot be calibrated. And then I was wondering, so your model, WEAP or SacWAM, will be calibrated to historical data or in some way to see the variability or uncertainty?
Right. So when I was referring to my use of PEST and the WEAP software, that's been with regards to calibrating hydrology, rainfall runoff processes. So that's how we've utilized PEST. So adjusting the parameters that affect infiltration and runoff, et cetera. As far as calibrating say, operations rules to try, to try to mimic what you actually see happening in the historical record. I haven't tried using PEST in that situation, but technically it would be possible. But as I said, I've only done it for the hydrology calculation.
So in calcium, you basically pre-process the hydrology, and then it's essentially an input to the XA solver. Is that the same in WEAP, or do you solve the hydrology with every single optimization iteration?
Well, the hydrology is calculated each time step prior to handing off the LP to the solver. But it's not pre-processed prior to the model run, if that's what you mean. Any other questions? Okay, very good. So let's move on to the SacWAM model itself, which is an application of the WEAP software. Keep in mind through this whole day, this is a large model, and we're just giving you kind of the 10,000-foot overview of it. And if you have questions, please reach out to Scott or to us to learn more about the model. So the model extent, similar to what Scott showed a little while ago, it's made up of the Sacramento Basin and the portion of the Trinity that contributes to imports into the Sacramento Basin. The east side streams are part of the model, as well as the delta. There's also a representation of operations south of the delta, including the San Luis Reservoir, the California Aqueduct, Delta Mendota Canal, and the demands on those canals. However, it's not to the same level of detail as the representation in the Sacramento region. And we'll explain that in more detail in the coming slides. So the current period of simulation for the model is 1922 to 2009, and that could be extended if needed. It's a fairly simple process of extending the input time series. It utilizes a monthly time step. So again, this addresses that question about the routing of water through the model. It includes a simulation of upper watershed hydrology and operations. It has the ability to calculate unimpaired flows, and I'll discuss what I mean by that in a little bit. It looks on the valley floor at agricultural, urban, and refuge water use. It was designed spatially so that it's calculating stream flows at key points of interest to the board. It has a representation of delta flows and salinity. And it has CVP and SWP operations built into it. And it also has local project operations. That is, operations on tributaries that are not part of the CVP or SWP. If we take a look at the schematic here, of course there's many rivers and streams. It doesn't have every stream in it, but it does have a lot of the tributaries, the major tributaries that flow into the Sacramento River. It has a representation of 52 reservoirs. It has urban demands, and we'll get into more detail on that in a few slides. Those are represented by what we call demand sites in the software. It has agricultural demand sites, which is a full hydrological calculation, and that's represented using what's called the catchment node. There are 76 of them. Refuges are also represented using the catchment nodes. We have 9. There are 173 stream flow gauges in there for use in comparing observed and simulated data. And then we have 110 flow requirements in the model. And those flow requirements are both regulatory flow requirements as well as what we call operational flow requirements, and I'll show you what I mean by that. And then also flow requirements that the board needs for doing its analysis. So here's a picture of the south of Delta representation. You can see it's much less detailed. But again, we do have the representation of the San Luis Reservoir, the DMC and the California Aqueduct, and the demands that pull water off of it. And that's all for the purpose of calculating exports from the Delta. So now we'll talk a bit about the upper watersheds. What I mean by the upper watersheds is the portion of the basin that's upstream of the rim reservoirs or those gauges that are close to the rim of the valley. And that's what's shown in color on this slide. If we zoom in a bit, here's the region around Lake Shasta. Upstream of Lake Shasta, we can see a couple of things here. We see an arc that's actually a fictitious arc that's called I_Shasta. And that's a specified inflow. The model has the option, with just the flick of a switch, of either calculating all the hydrology in the upper watersheds or turning that off and using specified inflows that were provided by DWR. If we're not using specified inflows, then we use catchments. And these are the object in WEAP that do the hydrology calculations. So in the example I'm showing here, this P501 Sacramento 010500, that's code that tells me it's in the Sacramento Basin, of course, but it's looking at the elevation band between 0 and 500 meters. It's representing all the land area in that elevation band. So all that land area is then divided into hydrologically similar units based on land cover type. And then there's a hydrologic calculation done for each of the unique hydrologic units. The hydrology calculation that's done uses what's called the soil moisture model. That's part of WEAP. Basically, this model, if you start here at the top of the figure and see the observed precipitation, so that's the boundary condition on the model at this point is precipitation, temperature, humidity, and wind speed. Those inputs are the boundary condition. Precipitation can fall either as snow or rain, depending on temperature. Snow can accumulate or snow can melt, depending on temperature. Snow melt or rainfall can then either infiltrate or create surface runoff, and that's a function of the moisture content in this top compartment of the model. The wetter it is, the more water will run off. Once water has infiltrated into that top compartment, it can either become interflow, which is a kind of a fairly rapid flow into the stream system. It can go back out the surface as bare soil evaporation or transpiration through the trees here, or it can move vertically downwards as percolation into a second compartment. And this second compartment is used to simulate the longer term response within the basin and generates the base flow. So that's the hydrology model that's used in the upper watersheds up above the rim reservoirs in SacWAM if the user chooses. Now I'll talk for a minute about infrastructure in the upper watersheds. The representation of infrastructure on the valley floor is much more detailed than it is in the upper watersheds. However, we do have the major reservoirs represented as well as the diversions that transport water in between basins and from stream system to stream system. Currently, the operations of those infrastructure are based on average monthly values. The example we have here is French Meadows Reservoir. We can see this is the limit on how full the reservoir can be in any given time step, and it's just a repeating time series that repeats for each year. In a similar fashion, we have water moving down this tunnel from French Meadows Reservoir to Hellhole Reservoir. And that's is done using one of these, what we call operational flow requirements. And again, that uses a monthly average time series to drive the flow through the tunnel. This approach is going to be refined in the near future. This was something we did to get it operating well enough, and then we turned our attention to the more complex problem on the valley floor. And we're going to be circling back to that now in the near future. So now we can talk about the valley floor. So that's basically the polygons you see here in the center of this map. Those represent water budget areas, and these are areas that are based on DWR planning boundaries. We have 22 of them on the valley floor. Oops. If we zoom in on one of them here, we're looking at part of WBA 3 up there in the northern part of the Sacramento Valley. And within each WBA, you have a representation of urban demands, of agricultural demands, and refuge demands if they exist. Let's talk about that in a little detail. If we zoom in a little further here, we can see we have the Sacramento River coming from the north to the kind of the southeast in this picture. We have the Bella Vista pipeline diverting water off of the Sacramento River. And then water is going to the urban demands, U03PU. The U stands for urban, the P stands for project. So this is water that I believe is going to the city of Reading in this case. A03PA is an agricultural demand. So this is where we have a catchment node that actually has irrigation occurring in it. And this is the Bella Vista Water District. I also want to point out over by the river, I don't know if you guys can see it, is A03SA. Again, that's agriculture, so that's an irrigated catchment. The SA stands for settlement contractor. So within each WBA, the agricultural demands have been broken into their contract type. You have non-project, project, and settlement contractors. And the reason for that is they're given different priorities in the priority structure. Let's talk a little bit about the irrigated area real quickly. So here's an example in a different WBA. Again, irrigated areas are represented using the catchment node. There are 22 different crops that can be represented. Not every catchment has all these crops, of course, but there's 22 options that can be used. And basically there's a hydrologic calculation done for each one of those crops in the model. And we also include in that the simulation of rice flooding and rice ET. Wildlife refuges are also represented using the catchment node. And it has 4 different flooded land types, the permanent, the semi-permanent, and 2 seasonals. And then there's also an uplands representation, land that is not flooded. The urban areas are represented in a slightly different way. We have a catchment node, that green node there, and that represents the actual area of the urban area, and that is used to generate rainfall runoff. So remember, in this model, we're representing every acre within the valley through those agricultural nodes, through the refuge nodes, and then through these catchment nodes used for the urban areas. But then we use a demand node also for the urban areas, and that's a representation of the actual water use that's been reported by purveyors. And that includes both the indoor and outdoor use. And demand nodes are different than the catchment nodes. They don't simulate hydrology. It's more of a time series demand for water, and then a specified consumption rate, and then a return flow. So I want to point out that the valley floor hydrology is different than what I showed you for the upper watersheds. The model used on the valley floor is called the Mabia model, and it actually runs at a daily time step. So it runs daily to simulate precipitation and the infiltration, evapotranspiration in a kind of similar way to the earlier model. However, those results are then aggregated up to the monthly time step, and that's when the water allocation is done. The evapotranspiration calculation in this model is based on the dual crop coefficient approach found in FAO 56. The infiltration feature in this model is based on a curve number approach. And we calibrated the evapotranspiration information in this model to values found in the DWR cup model, which builds on work that Andy and I did for the basin study. Now I'll switch gears a bit. I just wanted to point out the key locations when we designed the model that we needed to be sure to calculate stream flow. Because what we're doing is that we're basically subdividing the entire valley into hydrologic units, and we needed to be sure that they were subdivided in a way that we were calculating stream flow at the locations that the board needed. And basically, I think the simplest way to think about this is we needed to calculate stream flows at the points flowing into reservoirs, of course. We needed to calculate it at the mouths of tributaries to the Sacramento River, and then at key locations along the Sacramento River, mostly where the gauges are located. And that's what the dots on these two figures show you. The one on the left is the northern part of the valley, and the one on the right is the southern part. We also needed the ability to add flow requirements. Actually, adding a flow requirements is quite simple in the WEAP software. But I also want to point out that in the existing model, we've built up these flow requirements to start with SWRCB, which you may see if you're cruising around in the model. Those are the flow requirements the board asked us to add so that they could study various flow requirement regimes within the model. Okay, now I want to talk about the simulation of groundwater. We've divided the Sacramento Basin into 11 basins based on the Bulletin 118 boundaries. Some of those boundaries or basins, however, were aggregated. This is the same aggregation of basins that was used in the CVPA model. It's a relatively simple representation of the groundwater system. It's basically a bathtub, if you will, that has aerial recharge coming to it from recharge off of irrigated fields. There are losses along irrigation canals. Of course, there's groundwater pumping to provide irrigation water and water to M&I. And then there are stream aquifer interactions. The stream aquifer interactions are represented in a pretty simple way. Board staff ran the C2VSIM model and plotted the flow in the stream reach versus the stream gain. And what we're seeing in these graphs, if you look, say, on the left for the Sacramento River reach, you see a lot of negative numbers, and that means that there was losses from the stream to the groundwater system. And basically, we put a linear fit through that data. And that linear relationship can then be represented in the WEAP software. So as flows go down a stream, a fraction of it is lost to the groundwater system. Or if the flow is small enough, it actually takes water from the groundwater system. There's a gaining stream. But as I said, this is a pretty simple representation. Looks pretty good on the left. On the right here, we see Poudre Creek, where there's a lot more spread in the points from the C2VSIM model, which basically tells us in the C2VSIM model, the relative elevations of the stream surface and the groundwater water table are changing through time, and there's loss or gain depending on the situation. And the SacWAM model currently doesn't represent it in that fine a detail. We've just put this kind of average response into the model for now. Okay, and now I want to talk just a slide about unimpaired flows, because that's a key piece of information that the board is working with, and I want to try to define how we're calculating it. I want to point out that there's just a simple switch in what's called the key assumptions, which we can talk about this afternoon. So the user can change the model from kind of running everything to with one switch, turn all the operations off, and just have this unimpaired mode running. What that means is surface water diversions are halted, flow requirements are set to 0, and all reservoirs are turned off. So you basically are creating a model in which water just flows freely through the system. However, bypasses are left on, so we're not going back to a natural state. We're just going to a state where water can move freely through the system. So the bypasses remain on, so if water levels reach some threshold, they do spill over the weirs. The stream aquifer interactions are still on. And groundwater pumping to meet irrigation demands remains on, but it's restricted to the amount that occurs in the base run. So that does actually generate some return flows back into the stream. Okay, at this point I'm going to hand it off to Andy. He'll take it from here.
Good morning. Thank you all for coming. I recognize a lot of you, but for those I don't know, my name is Andy Draper. I'm a principal engineer with MWH and have been working with SEI on this project for about 2 years. I'm going to finish up or wrap up the presentation on SacWAM. I've got about 15 minutes of slides, and then we'll throw it open for questions, followed by a short break. The delta is probably the most complex component of SacWAM. This is primarily due to the need to represent water quality objectives and standards implemented in Water Right Decision 1641, and the need to represent reverse flows in the Old and Middle River. Additionally, the WEAP software imposes a couple of constraints on the model builder. The software does not allow reverse flows to occur in rivers and streams, and neither does it allow a direct representation of distributaries where one river will split into 2 or more distributaries. To represent the delta, we followed an approach adopted by DWR, dividing the delta region into 7 subregions, in this slide labeled NA1 through NA7. And associated with each of those subregions is a accretion and a depletion. The accretions represent the results of precipitation on the land surface and rainfall runoff, and the depletions represent the process of evapotranspiration from the land surface. On the left of this slide, you'll see that there are 2 methods or 2 ways in which SacWAM can simulate the accretions and depletions. In the first method, we use WEAP's catchment objects to dynamically simulate the rainfall runoff, infiltration processes and the associated crop water demand and evapotranspiration, the need for irrigation and irrigation return flows. The alternative is to adopt pre-processed time series made available by DWR, and this is the default option at the moment in SacWAM. And the purpose for this is to provide some consistency with the calcium-2 modeling and the DSM-2 model, DWR's hydrodynamic and water quality model of the delta. I'm going to show you a couple of screenshots of the delta as it's represented in SacWAM. This is the portion downstream of the Sacramento-San Joaquin confluence. And you'll see an outflow arc with a series of orange circles with crosses through them. These purple objects represent in-stream flow requirements. Working from left to right, we have a placeholder for any in-stream flow requirements that may result from the revised water quality control plan. We have an in-stream flow requirement to represent the flows, the outflows specified in D1641. We have a third in-stream flow requirement to represent the X2 requirements specified in D1641 and the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service biological opinion. And lastly, we have an in-stream flow requirement that is currently turned off in SacWAM. Originally, we modeled salinity in the delta using Contra Costa Water District G model, but at a later date, we replaced the G model with DWR's artificial neural network. This may be a little hard to see for the folks at the back. It's now showing the portion of the SacWAM schematic for the South Delta. On the right, you have the San Joaquin River downstream of Vernalis and the diversion from the San Joaquin River into the Old River. I said that WEAP software does not allow you to directly model distributaries, so we have to represent the flow at the head river, the flow into the head of the Old River as a diversion arc shown in orange. The two orange arcs on the left represent the California Aqueduct and the Delta Mendota Canal. And then you'll see, top left, you'll see two parallel arcs in blue. These arcs represent the Old and Middle River combined. And since we can't represent two-way flow in a river, we have to have two parallel arcs, one representing flow from south to north, the other one representing flows from north to south. Finally, this part of the SacWAM schematic shows the mouth of the Old and Middle Rivers. We have flows, as I said, north to south and south to north in the Old River. We also represent Indian Slough. And for those of you not familiar with this part of the Delta, export pumping at Banks and Tracy, or Jones pumping plant, draws water from the north from the San Joaquin River to the south. This is reverse flow in the Old and Middle Rivers. But there's not a one-to-one relationship. Increasing pumping at the export facilities is partially offset by Indian Slough and flow through Indian Slough. But that flow through Indian Slough is south of the compliance locations for measuring reverse flows, so we have to include that in the model. I'm going to briefly go through the components of the Central Valley Project and State Water Project represented in SacWAM. Looking first at the Central Valley Project, we include all the major facilities of the CVP, Trinity, Shasta, Folsom in the north, the downstream re-regulating reservoirs, Whiskeytown, Keswick, Lake Natomas, Black Butte Dam on Stony Creek, some of the conveyance facilities Chuck talked about, Bella Vista Pipeline. We include the Teomar-Colusa Canal and the Folsom South Canal. The Delta Cross Channel is incorporated in the model. It's important for water quality calculations. Jones Pumping Plant, the Delta Mendota Canal, and we include the Mendota Pool. South of the Delta, we have CVP San Luis, Cross Valley Canal, and diversions to the San Felipe unit. And because SacWAM is really a model of the Sacramento Valley and Delta, and our boundary to the model is the Vernalis gauge on the San Joaquin River, we don't dynamically simulate New Melones on the Stanislaus River, and we exclude all of Millerton and the Friant Division. Turning now to the State Water Project, We represent a couple of the larger state water project reservoirs or lakes upstream from Oroville in the Upper Feather River Watershed. We include the Oroville Thermaliter Complex, Banks Pumping Plant, and the California Aqueduct, the North Bay Aqueduct and South Bay Aqueduct, and the SWP portion of San Luis Reservoir. What we don't include at the moment are the terminal reservoirs on the California Aqueduct down in California, Southern California, or for the South Bay Aqueduct, Del Valle Reservoir. Chuck talked a little bit about agricultural, urban, and refuge demands. I just wanted to reiterate how the model represents the water demands for CVP and SWP contractors. When we look at north of the Delta and we look at agricultural demands and refuge demands, we're using catchment objects. So we're simulating all of the irrigation demand dynamically on that daily time step using the Mabia model. The M&I demands, so think of the M&I demands, for example, of Folsom Lake on the Lower American River. Those demands are developed based on historical production data, typically for the 5-year period 2006 through 2010. They are constant year to year, and we have a constant monthly pattern. So essentially the urban water demands are a 12-month repeating time series. South of the Delta, things are a little simpler. We don't represent land use based demands. Instead, we use full contract amount as a surrogate for water demand. And on the transmission link from the California Aqueduct to the CVP and SWP contractor, we constrain the delivery to the allocation. So again, the demand sites that we're using south of the Delta, we're using full contract amount as a surrogate for water demand, and then we constrain the delivery through the transmission link to the allocation, which is being dynamically determined in SacWAM. Looking at those allocations, the allocations are all dynamically calculated or dynamically simulated. For the settlement and exchange contractors, they're a function of the hydrology and the inflow to Shasta and Lake Oroville. We have allocation logic for north of Delta water service contractors, and we distinguish between ag, M&I, and wetland or refuge water use. We have another allocation process for contractors south of the Delta, and for the CVP they are split into ag, M&I, and refuge allocations. For the State Water Project, we have an allocation process for the Feather River Service Area, which is based on the inflow to Lake Oroville. And we have a second allocation process for the 29 long-term State Water Project contractors, and that's for the delivery of Table A water. We also represent the delivery of what I call Article 21, or surplus water. In terms of the CVP, SWP operations, we represent COA, which is the 1986 agreement, which specifies sharing formula for meeting responsibilities assigned by the State Board for meeting D1641 standards and for sharing what I call unregulated inflow to the Delta. We represent the requirements of D1641, and we also represent the 2008-2009 biological opinions from the Fish and Wildlife Service and NIMS. So although the CVP and SWP have been a major focus in model development, there's been an equal focus on local project operations. Chuck described that in many of the upper watersheds, currently we have a simplified approach for simulating hydropower facilities in which we've looked at average monthly storage over the last 20 to 30 years and imposed that as a constraint on those reservoirs. However, we have a more sophisticated approach on the watersheds listed here, in which the reservoirs are being dynamically operated to meet a downstream demand. So this is true for Campfire West on the Bear River. On Cache Creek, it's true for Clear Lake and Indian Valley Reservoir, which are operated by Yolo County Flood Control and Water Conservation District. On the Calaveras River, we have a dynamic simulation of New Hogan Reservoir, which is operated by Stockton East Water District to meet their agricultural and municipal demands. On the Consumnes, we have Lake Jenkinson, which is operated by El Dorado Irrigation District. On the McCollum, we're dynamically simulating both the upper watersheds, the reservoirs in the upper watersheds, which belong to PG&E, and we're also operating Pardee and Comanche to meet East Bay mud demands through the McCollum Aqueduct and demands on the lower McCollum River. On the Pewter Creek, we're dynamically simulating Lake Berryessa to meet the demands on Pewter South Canal. On Stony Creek, we're simulating East Park, Stony Gorge, and Black Butte. And then finally, on the North Fork of the Yuba River, we're operating New Bullards Bar Reservoir, which is owned and operated by Yuba County Water Agency, both to meet their contractor demands on the lower Yuba River and to meet flow standards on the lower Yuba River. Okay, so with that, I'm going to pause or stop, and I think Chuck and I are going to throw it open for questions. So if there are any, and then afterwards we'll take a break.
The question is about unimpaired flows. So did you turn off ET for all the crops in unimpaired flow?
No, the ET remains on.
Okay. The second question is about groundwater. So all the pumping was on
For the unimpaired flows?
for the unimpaired flows?
Yes, the pumping is on, but it's restricted to the amount that would occur in a base run in which all the infrastructure is operating.
I may have to talk to you later. Thank you.
Yeah, okay.
I have a question about the upper watershed hydrology. So why WEAP decided to use soil moisture model to prepare the hydrology instead of using recorded flow directly from gauge stations?
Actually, there's a switch in the model. The user can choose to simulate the hydrology using the soil moisture model, which makes the boundary condition the climatic inputs. And the reason for having that capability is if the board wants to use the model in climate change analysis. If you flip the switch the other way, it just uses specified inflows that were provided by DWR. Oh, and I think I forgot to say during my talk, for all the results that you'll see today, they're based on a model run using those specified inflows and not the hydrology calculations in the upper watersheds.
So my name is John Rubin. I have a more general question. It might be more appropriate for someone from the state board, but I'm familiar generally with CalSim, and my understanding with CalSim is it's intended to provide information regarding specifically Central Valley Project, State Water Project operations. It's not clear to me the answer, kind of the purpose for the model that's been developed. I wonder if somebody from the State Board, or if you can share with us what kind of answers this model is intended to provide.
John, were you here earlier for Scott's presentation?
I was, and I understood that this new model is intended to be more user friendly. I guess what I'm struggling with is
Can we show your slide again, which talks about, he had a slide where he talked about how he planned to use the model and what the flow outputs would be used for, and we'll have it brought up again.
And then maybe as you talk about that, you know, is it trying to solve a problem with CalSim? Is it trying to answer different questions?
So,
and I ask this in the context of maybe some history, as I understand it, with CalSim being developed again for understanding operations, and this model being focused on assisting the State Board with water quality planning.
yeah, it's a good question. And I'm sorry that wasn't clear earlier. But I'd say that the big limitation that we saw with CalSim 2 for use in the Phase 2 update of the Water Quality Control Plan is that CalSim has very detailed operations for SWP and CVP project operations, as you commented. However, all of the non-project tributaries, such as Cache and Puta and Mokelumne and the Yuba, those tributaries are not dynamically operated in CalSim 2. Those are represented as a pre-processed time series, so none of those upstream reservoirs are represented in CalSim 2. And in the Phase 2 process, the board may potentially add new flow requirements on each of those tributaries. And so as part of the impact analysis for the board to understand, you know, what are the impacts to adding a new stream flow requirement to the mouths of these tributaries, we need to understand what is going to be impact on those diversions and the reservoir storages and things like that. And so that wasn't capable, in CalSim 2, doesn't have the capabilities of operating those reservoirs and diversions.
And that's helpful. Was there any thought about expanding the factors that could be included in the analysis to deal with other constituents, characteristics of the water, like temperature, turbidity, which may also be of interest to the State Water Board?
So those are definitely of interest to the State Water Board. And the SacWAM model does not calculate that. WEAP software does have the capability of simulating water quality. However, in SacWAM, we are not using that. So we anticipate if those type of analyses will occur in Phase 2, it will be results from SacWAM will then be fed into specific water quality or temperature models.
So this is a follow-up question on unimpaired flow. So my question is, so I understand that ET will not be turned off on the valley floor and that groundwater pumping will not be turned off. Does that mean that it's assuming current level land use?
That's correct.
Which is different from DWR's calculation of unimpaired flow?
I'm not familiar with the details of the DWR calculation, but in SacWAM, it's the same land use that's present in all the model runs.
So in DWR's calculation of unimpaired flow, they assume that valley floor land use is native vegetation.
So is that more the natural flow? I'm not. I know we have to be careful on what we call these things.
No, but the irrigated agriculture is removed and replaced with a category that's called native vegetation, but it's not.
Okay.
Again, it's not purported to be natural.
Okay. Well, that could be done easily, actually, in this model, but that's not the way we've run it so far.
I just wanted to add one thing, is that Within WEAP and in SacWAM, it doesn't require all those demands to be met. So if, for an example, in the unimpaired flow simulation, we can have this current land use, and we can limit groundwater pumping to the baseline study, and there might not be enough water to meet that current demand, right? There's no diversions from the river to feed those fields, so there may be unmet demand in certain areas. So even though those plants are there might not be enough water to meet that demand, if that makes sense.
So my question will be kind of non-technical. We know to my understanding, CVP and the State Water Project, we may still use a calcium to determine the long-term operation. And as far as SacWAM, if your model result is different than the calcium 2, then how do you handle those conditions? Since you have a regulatory implication, and if inconsistent with calcium, that means your model may be inconsistent with project operation.
So we'll be using SacWAM for our environmental analysis for phase 2. And in this situation, we will be comparing one model run against a base run, so it will always be a comparative analysis. We will not be, at this point, be running it for instance, deciding how the projects should be operated on a day-to-day or a monthly basis is simply to show the impacts from a proposed alternative regulatory regime. So it's always comparing one result against another result.
So I'm still trying to sort of understand a little bit better how, if you are using the Watershed hydrology module or model, I notice you're using like a potential evapotranspiration and crop coefficients for, determining how much ET occurs. So are those crop coefficients model parameters that you calibrate, or are those something that you take from, the literature and you use those particular values? How does that work? And I have one follow-up question too.
So I assume you're referring to the valley floor simulation?
No, I'm talking about the upper watersheds where you're showing your ET model has a function, a crop coefficient, right, and a PET.
Right. So when I calibrated those hydrology models, I adjusted basically the soil parameters, and those in turn affect the retained moisture in the soil, which in turn affects how much actual transpiration happens. So part of the calibration process was looking at the mass balance at the gauge, and if I had too much flow, I knew I needed to increase evapotranspiration, so I would adjust the soil parameters to do that.
Yeah, so the calibration is done really through the soil parameters, not through changing the KC values that you're using for ET.
That's correct.
You just took something from the literature as a representative KC value there.
That's right.
And the PET, is that calculated?
That's calculated within the model using the inputs of temperature, humidity, and wind speed.
And what PET model,
It's
like the
Penman
Monteith with,
yeah,
with a set canopy resistance or something like that?
Exactly.
Yeah,
yep.
Okay. Yeah, and then the other question I had is, in the allocation process, right, we start off making allocations, early in the year, and they're sort of updated, as we, see more how the snowpack, might still accumulate and, that sort of stuff. How are you, and then at a certain point, we make an allocation, say 50%, right? Which then impacts the, the deliveries that we're intending to make, although sometimes it does get changed a little bit. But regardless, how are you capturing, the allocations and, making them affect the actual, quantity of water that would be delivered?
There are two different methods, depending on whether you're dynamically simulating the upstream watersheds or you're using pre-processed time series of unimpaired flows. If we assume that CVP allocations are based on, say, a 19% exceedance forecast, a conservative forecast, then we can either use time series data of forecasts that were developed by DWR's snow surveys. Alternatively, if we're running the upper watersheds, the model uses forecasts based on snowpack conditions.
So those snowpack conditions would into the, say if you're making a February allocation or something like that. So then you have some time series that would account for, how much at the 90% exceedance level, how much additional inflow we would expect from that point in time forward?
So the model can take the existing snowpack and it can look at a 90% exceedance for precipitation and develop a forecast.
So that would be then sort of based on historical information, correct, for the 90% exceedance? Or do you actually look at your forcing, meteorology and calculate that out? How does that work?
If you were using a climate change scenario, then you may want to run the model and then update your 90% exceedance forecast.
Okay, all right, thank you.
But yeah, currently it's historical.
Thank you.
And I have two questions. And so you mentioned M&I demand nodes have a fixed quantity. So does it mean you apply the fixed quantity from 1922 to 2009? That's our first question. The second question is, what is a base run pumping quantity? I was not really clear what was the base run.
Okay, well, I'll answer the first one because it's easier to answer. First of all, although we're using the 1922 to 2009 hydrology, we are conducting what's called an existing level of development study. So the land use, the regulations, facilities are all held constant. And what you're essentially looking at is you should think about model results as just being a range of water supply conditions and delivery reliability. The urban demands are constant year to year. We didn't try to develop a varying outdoor demand with variations in precipitation and temperature. So both indoor and outdoor are constant with a constant monthly pattern. And that was taken from production data, either published in the 2010 Urban Water Management Plans or from DWR's Public Water Supply Statistics database. Sorry, just remind me again the second question.
Can you explain what's a base run groundwater pumping? I'm not really clear what does a base run really means.
Yeah, so the idea was that how these unimpaired flows are represented and what this theoretic value, I guess, represents, right? And we want to keep land use and the groundwater pumping, things like that, constant to current conditions. And so basically that baseline groundwater pumping comes from basically you run the SacWAM baseline simulation or a current conditions simulation. And the groundwater pumping then that you've calculated in that baseline simulation, you export as a time series and then becomes input to the unimpaired flow simulation.
So kind of follow up with that same question on the unimpaired flow. My experience is on doing the reservoirs, you're significantly, of course, changing the flow pattern and flow regime on a seasonal basis, and that would affect your depletions on a seasonal and monthly, of course. And so using the same C2V sim run as the baseline may not necessarily be the most valid argument. And so have you folks thought about rerunning C2 VSIM with unimpaired flow regime? And that would specifically, not necessarily more so on the major tributaries, but on some of the non-project tributaries makes a big difference in my experience. And my other question, before I pass the mic on, is have you guys done a comparison between calcium 2 and this model for the base case?
Yeah, so what you've kind of hit upon is definitely a kind of something that we encountered throughout this whole process as being a challenge, I guess, and the simulating unimpaired flows over a period of this whole 82-year simulation is difficult because what we want to represent by these unimpaired flows are basically what would happen if you removed the reservoirs, stopped diversions from the streams and rivers, and let this water flow down through the system as it currently is, right? But what happens if you do that over an 82-year period of simulation? We see trends in groundwater elevation and things like, and specifically groundwater elevation, right? We see groundwater elevation increasing or decreasing in places where there's, not groundwater pumping occurring at, different levels, or there's just not water being applied to fields in the way that they are under current conditions, right? And so you see things like trends in groundwater elevation, which then adds, if you've got a dynamic simulation of stream groundwater interaction in C2V sim, we see these trends in stream groundwater interactions. And we see at the end of that simulation, we see groundwater conditions that are far different than the current groundwater conditions. And we see stream groundwater interactions that are very different than what we see in current, or estimates of current stream groundwater interactions with C2 VSIM, for example, in the historical run, the later years of the historical run. And so how we dealt with this was we did a C2 VSIM simulation where we reset groundwater elevation to the current conditions every year. And so we did an ensemble approach to where we basically would be able to simulate these current conditions, stream losses and gains from the rivers to the groundwaters with the varying hydrology that we see over this 82-year period. And so that C2 VSIM run was what we used to inform the SacWAM model. And that's why also when Chuck explained the way that we're representing these stream groundwater interactions in a way that's somewhat simple, that it only takes into account the stream flow. It doesn't take into account the groundwater elevation. And SacWAM has the capability of having that dynamic stream groundwater interaction, but the challenge is more of simulating this 82-year period and the trends that you see over that period, and what is the meaning in that. I think that it gets to a question of, what is the value in simulating 82 years of record? We don't anticipate the next 82 years to be similar to the last 82 years. It's more to capture the variability in the hydrology. And there's definitely some things to be learned over looking at the different regulatory regimes and the impacts on things like groundwater. But we chose to separate the groundwater from the stream water for that reason. I don't know if that answered your question. If not, we can discuss it later. But I had a second question of whether we compared it. with other models. And yes, we're actually working on that now. We've worked with DWR to develop new unimpaired flow estimates throughout the valley floor using a model called the Sacramento Valley Unimpaired Flow Model. And so you can find a description of that model in an appendix that's now posted on the SacWAM website, where we compare make some comparisons with calcium 2. And we're also going to release a comparison of unimpaired flows directly with that, but it's not done yet.
I have several questions. I'll go from simplest to more complex. How do you represent the inflow at Vernalis?
It's defined in an input file, in a CSV file. Currently, it's taken from a calcium 2 simulation. We use the 2015 State Water Project Delivery Capability Report. There is also the option of changing a switch and using flows that are consistent with the phase 1 work that the State Board conducted.
Okay, thank you. You said that the upstream reservoirs and operations were operated to meet downstream demand. Can you explain what you mean by that a little bit?
Oh, sure. Well, let's take a very simple case. So if we look at Pewter Creek and Lake Berryessa, we have an in-stream flow requirement at the near the mouth of Pewter Creek, representing the 2000 settlement agreement to maintain flows throughout the year. So reservoir releases have to meet that in-stream flow requirement. We also dynamically simulate the Pewter South Canal and the agricultural and urban demands on that canal. So that those water deliveries will be made to meet those water demands as constrained by contract allocations and contract agreements. So each month, the reservoir is making, or SacWAM is making, a release decision from Lake Berryessa, A, to meet the in-stream flow requirement in the lower Pewter Creek, and then secondly, to meet demands of the Pewter South Canal.
All right, but when you were talking about that, you weren't discussing sort of reservoir operations upstream of the rim dams, is that correct?
Well, currently we have a slight mix. So maybe the way to illustrate that is to look at the Bear River. Okay. So there are 3 reservoirs on the Bear River, Rollins, Combi, and Campfire West. So currently those top 2 reservoirs are constrained, so the top of storage can't be above the average monthly historical value. So we're basically telling SacWAM, simulate those reservoirs. This is the upper storage. In dry years when there's not enough flow in the river, storage may drop below that rule curve. Think of it as being a rule curve based on average historical monthly storage. So that's true of Rollins and Combi. When we get down to Campfire West, we don't impose that rule curve. Instead, releases from Campfire West are made either to meet the settlement agreement with DWR to release so much water from the Bear River to the Feather River, or to meet Campfire West Irrigation District and South Sutter Water District demands.
All right, thank you. And the last question is, did you encounter situations where you couldn't meet biological opinion requirements? And if so, what did you do in that case?
One of the outputs from model is you can look at what we call coverage. So you can look at months when you didn't meet 100% of the requirement, and that includes both water demands and biological opinions. Those biological opinions and required delta outflow have very high priorities, so they're met first. before meeting south of Delta allocations and deliveries. So the quick answer is no. We currently have an issue in 1977 where Lake Oroville is drawn down to unrealistic levels. So we may be violating some of the in-stream flow requirements. But we aim to sort that out with developing different priorities on reservoir storage to try and maintain Oroville storage. But at the moment, the biological opinions, delta outflow, D1641 standards have a very high priority in the model.
Thank you.
These are great questions, folks, but I think in order to fit in the next session prior to our lunch break, we're going to need to wrap these up for now. But Andy and I are going to be around, and for those of you here in the afternoon, of course, there should be plenty of time to ask us additional questions. So should we take the break? Yeah? What time do you think? 11? Let's try to be back here by 11:10 at the latest. So 15-minute break. Thanks.
Hello? Huh? Okay. Folks, can we take a seat, and we're about to start the next session. Okay, in this second session, I'm going to show some model results. You've heard about the WEAP software, you've heard about the implementation. Now we're going to look at the where the rubber meets the road, I suppose, and look at some model results compared to both observed historical data, and we're also going to look at model results compared to calcium 2. So the first part of the model assessment is on the hydrology, and I'm going to focus on the valley floor. And so what we wanted to do was to have some assessment of stream groundwater interaction, irrigation demands, return flows, rainfall runoff. So what we did is we considered a control volume around the Sacramento Valley floor. And for the downstream boundary, we took a point on the Sacramento River below the gauge at Freeport and below the point of discharge from the Sac Regional Wastewater Treatment Plant. So that's really the Sacramento River flow coming into the delta. On the west side of the Sacramento Valley, we took a point on Knight's Landing Ridge Cut, which is the outflow from the Colusa Basin into the Yellow Bypass. So that was our downstream outflow points. For the upstream boundary, we considered points downstream of the foothill dams, i.e. the flow downstream or the release from Oroville or the release from Shasta or downstream of Whiskeytown. And we also ran the control volume downstream of the unregulated inflow from the upstream watersheds. So if we look at the outflows minus the inflows, we're capturing all the valley floor accretions and depletions. In the wintertime, you have an accretion from rainfall runoff, and in the summer, you have a depletion mainly through irrigated agriculture. So this, we focused on monthly results for over the last 20 years of simulation. So 20 years of simulation, 1990 to 2009. In all these charts, the blue dots are going to represent SacWAM, and the red lines are going to represent historical data. So this is an exceedance plot. The positive values are accretions, and they're on the left, the positive values. The negative values are the depletions. And they range from about 1.5 to plus 1.5 to minus 1.5 million acre feet a month. So, a lot of water, very significant. What we did for assessing the model was to just focus on the non-flood months. So we eliminated the months when there were spills occurring historically at the Fremont Weir and over the Sacramento Weir. And the reason for this is we don't have a good handle on those very large volumes. There are inconsistencies between the gauge record for the Yellow Bypass near Woodland and the gauge record for spills over the weirs and the inflow from the Colusa Basin. So basically we're comparing the drier 90-95% of months. And you'll see that we've got a good agreement in this exceedance plot. How we got that agreement was to adjust two aspects of the model. First of all, we adjusted the parameters for the rainfall runoff, we're using the Soil Conservation Service curve number method. So we tweaked some of the CN values. Originally we had textbook values for the different land use classifications. So we changed those slightly to either increase or decrease runoff. And then during the summer months, we globally changed irrigation efficiencies and largely focused on rice and the amount of flow through in the system. This shows the same data as average monthly values. I think the bias, I thought I'd added it to this chart, but I believe the bias is about 5 or 6%. But we do a good job now representing both the winter accretions and the summer depletions. So again, if you look at the left-hand side, the positive values, those are basically inflow from rainfall runoff, and then the April through November, you're actually seeing depletions from the system, mainly through irrigation use. Just as a check, we've now globally changed or adjusted irrigation efficiencies and some of the rice parameters such as flow through. So we looked at the 15 largest diversions, which represent about 80% of the deliveries in the Sacramento Valley. There we are. We had a bias there of 6%. Sorry, I was confusing the two biases. This was a 6% bias. So a positive bias means that we're diverting approximately 6% more in SacWAM compared to historical data. The next exercise was to validate the project operations for the CVP and SWP. There's considerable logic being developed for SacWAM. We talked about the allocations, there's coordinated operations agreement, there's the outflow requirements, there's restrictions on pumping imposed by Old and Middle River. So there's a huge amount of code that's been developed for those operations. We decided to do the validation, comparing the model to Calcium 2, which you've heard earlier is this default model for CVP-SW planning purposes, developed jointly by DWR and Reclamation. Period of simulation are not quite the same. Both models start in water year 1922. Calcium 2 extends through 2003. SacWAM extends through 2009. So we just looked at the common 82-year period ending in 2003. What I'm going to show you is just a series of results. One set from SacWAM, the other set from Calcium 2. The Calcium 2 results come from the 2015 State Water Project Delivery Capability Report, and that model is on DWR's website if you wish to take a look at it. The aspects of operations that we wanted to check or validate included the imports from the Trinity River system through the Clear Creek Tunnel, CVP and SWP storage north of the Delta, and then river flows in rivers that are affected by that upstream storage regulation, principally the Feather, American, and Sacramento River. We wanted to look at delta inflows, delta outflows, and delta exports, and then lastly look at off-stream storage in San Luis Reservoir. So all of these charts are the same. Those sitting at the back are going to probably have a tough time seeing or distinguishing some of the lines. Starting at the chart on the top left is monthly time series data. Then moving clockwise, we have average monthly flows. Bottom right, we have annual flows, or in the case of reservoirs, we'll be showing carryover storage, September carryover storage. And lastly, bottom left, we're showing exceedance. In all of these plots, the blue is SacWAM, and the orange line is calcium 2. And I put at the title, just below the title, I put the calcium 2 average annual value, and then the SacWAM bias compared to calcium 2. I hesitate to use the word bias, but let's say difference. So for Trinity River imports, SacWAM is currently importing about 13% more water than calcium 2. If you look at the top right chart of average monthly flows, you'll see that the models are very similar in the summer, but in some winter months of some years, there is a significant difference. And we trace this down to different logic and different operations when there are releases from Trinity Dam for flood control purposes. So currently in SacWAM, if there's a flood control release, say the delta's in excess conditions and there are high flood flows in the Sacramento River, SacWAM currently still imports water through the Clear Creek Tunnel for power purposes. Under those same conditions, calcium 2 maintains those flood releases from Trinity Dam in the Trinity River. So this is a difference in logic that could easily be adjusted, and so that we would better match the calcium 2 logic. We now look at CVP north of Delta storage. So this is storage in Trinity, Shasta, and Folsom. Again, we're looking at time series data, average monthly values. Now we're looking at carryover storage, bottom right, and exceedance. When you look at the bias, so currently SacWAM carryover storage is approximately 10% higher than calcium 2. However, the variation is very similar, both from month to month and year to year. I think I would suggest that having a little more carryover storage than calcium 2 is a good thing. When we look at storage in Oroville for the State Water Project, there's now only a 6% difference. SacWAM, again, showing a little more storage than calcium 2, 6% higher carryover storage. I think I misspoke before the break. I said that in 1 year there was a problem with storage in Oroville. I think I said 1997. I meant to say 1977. You'll see on the top left, you'll see that the blue line drops well below the critical amount of about 850,000 acre-feet. So we still need to address some of the storage operations for the State Water Project in these really dry conditions. Looking now at flows in the Feather, American, and Sacramento. Again, this is now compared to calcium 2. We're not looking at historical data yet. When we look at the Gridley gauge, which is downstream of the return flow from Thermalito Afterbay, so this is what we call the high flow channel, but it's upstream of the Yuba and Bear inflows. Currently, there's about a 10% higher flow in SacWAM, or about 200 to 300,000 acre-feet a year. We've traced this to the Upper Feather watershed. Currently, SacWAM is dynamically simulating the facilities in the Upper Feather. We're dynamically simulating exports from the west branch of the Feather River. We're dynamically simulating imports from the Yuba River. We're dynamically simulating those hydropower facilities, albeit using average monthly storage conditions. We've identified that we're actually importing too much water into that Upper Feather and not exporting enough. So this is, again, something that we'll be addressing in the coming weeks. American River at Fair Oaks. So, downstream of Lake Natoma. Again, SacWAM is showing more water in the American River. The reason for this is actually very clear. SacWAM for water demands on the American River is using recent historical production data. So we're modeling actual M&I demands as they were between 2006 and 2010. That was the period we chose to focus on. Calcium 2 uses contract amounts as a surrogate for water demands. And Calcium 2 typically looks at full development or, if not full development, certainly demands that are much higher than existing water use. So there is a significant difference between SacWAM diversions from, say, Folsom and calcium 2. So really calcium 2 is simulating the responsibilities, I guess you could put it, of the CVP to make water available to its contractors and senior water right holders, where we're simulating what's actually happening today in terms of water demands. Despite those differences on the Feather River, on the American River, when we look at the flows or compare the flows below Freeport, and this includes the wastewater treatment plant discharge, we find that the two models are in very close agreement. The difference is less than 1%. So just to recap, we're using, for the upper watersheds, we're using inflows based on gauge data. So the inflows to calcium 2 and SacWAM from those upper watersheds are very similar. But we are dynamically simulating stream losses. We're dynamically simulating rainfall runoff. We have a completely different irrigation model that I believe is more up-to-date than calcium 2. So, but despite all of those differences, when we get to Freeport, the two models are, I think, surprisingly close. Now we look at delta inflow. Again, it may look very close, but if you look at that bias on SacWAM, it's jumped from less than 1% to now 3%. So the question is, where did that extra water come from? At Freeport, we had great agreement, and then suddenly we've got more water in SacWAM. So I developed this chart to try and explain this. The white region at the center of that map is the delta region. It's labeled detour in this figure, but that represents the 680,000 acre region of the delta. The orange areas are areas outside of the delta, but downstream of flow gauges. So these represent areas which would be downstream of Freeport, downstream of, let's say, the Woodbridge gauge on the Mokelumne, downstream of Michigan Bar. So these are areas where we don't really have any historical records of runoff, or if we do have records, they're from discontinued gauges that are 20, 30 years out of date. And to a large extent, runoff from these areas is not included in calcium 2. So this is an area that we know, as a group of SacWAM modelers, we need to, SEI and MWH and the board need to have another look at, have we got the right amount of runoff from these ungauged areas that contribute flow to the delta. We're now going to look at required delta outflow. So this is the flow needed to meet the requirements, the flow requirements specified in D1641, the X2 location specified in D1641, and the biological opinion, the Fish and Wildlife Service biological opinion, and the outflow needed to meet the salinity standards as calculated by DWR's artificial neural network, which is used in both models. So I think 3% required delta outflow, difference of 3% is actually very close. When we look at surplus delta outflow, so this is water that is in excess of the regulatory requirements. So typically this is flows occurring in the winter and spring months, and either the projects aren't able to capture this water and export it because of export constraints, or they're already pumping up to permitted capacity. You see a bias now of 4%. Most of that difference is driven by differences in delta inflow, and I said the runoff from those ungauged areas around the delta. Looking at a comparison of CVP south of delta exports, so this is water passing through the export pumps and being delivered to CVP contractors from the Delta Mendota Canal, Mendota Pool, San Felipe unit, from the joint reach of the California Aqueduct. Two models are showing good agreement. There's a difference of 2%. Again, that 2% is probably being driven by the hydrology rather than difference in operational logic. Things are things don't compare so well for the State Water Project. SacWAM, I believe SacWAM deliveries to the State Water Project are a little high at the moment. They're 7% higher than calcium 2. I'm sure that will please some folks, and other folks may be less pleased, but this is something that we need to look at again and try and track down those differences. Lastly, two charts of operations in San Luis Reservoir. SacWAM is very close to calcium 2 for storage in the CVP share of SacWAM. Less close for the State Water Project. Currently, SacWAM seems to be holding too much water in San Luis Reservoir. I think this is something to do with our San Luis rule curve that we haven't adjusted for the slightly different hydrology that exists in SacWAM. So we're now going to compare SacWAM results to historical data. We're going to look at the period 2000 to 2009, and I want to show a couple of charts that compare deliveries to CVP, SWP contractors north of the Delta to actual historical deliveries. These are the diversions from the Thermalito Afterbay. So this is in the Feather River service area, and the State Water Project has signed settlement agreements. This is water that's being delivered to Western Canal, Richvale Canal, and the Joint Board Canal. There's a bias compared to historical data of about -1%, so very close for the last 10 years. This is for the American River, and with these diversions I included the diversion to the City of Sacramento's Sacramento River Water Treatment Plant. I did that because the city operates or has 2 points of diversion, one on the American and one on the lower Sacramento River, and I wanted to look at demands rather than operational logic, which might be switching the point of diversion from the Fairburn Water Treatment Plant to the Sac River Water Treatment Plant. SacWAM actually has a negative bias at the moment, about -9%. As a volume, that might be quite small, but I need to go back and look at some of that historical purveyor data and try and understand what's happening there, whether we've missed some, whether this might be because of some wholesale agreements that some of the senior water right holders have with other districts. I'm not sure. But the monthly pattern follows very closely the historical data. Lastly, this is a chart of CVP deliveries to its water service contractors. These are contractors in the Reading Basin that get their water from Whiskeytown, Bella Vista Water District that Chuck mentioned in one of his examples, Teomar-Calusa Canal. So these deliveries are being driven both by demands and allocations. But in this case, we're very close at about plus 1% compared to historical. So that was a focus on CVP and SWP and the accretions and depletions for the Sacramento Valley as a whole. Lastly, I just wanted to look at local operations. We're now going to look at a slightly longer historical period, 1990 to 2009. So rather than focus on the last 10 years, which we did for deliveries, because in a lot of cases, demands have changed over the last 10, 20 years. We're going to look at reservoir operations over the last 20 years. I'm going to divide it up into watersheds on the west side of the Sacramento Valley, on the east side of the Sacramento Valley, and lastly, east side streams. I did originally put together a set of charts which showed storage, diversions, outflow at the mouth of these tributaries, but it quickly came too long. And so I'm just going to focus on storage as an indicator of how well we're simulating local operations. In this case, we've aggregated 3 reservoirs on Stony Creek, East Park, Stony Gorge, and Black Butte. And you can see that, again, blue is SacWAM, red is historical, that we're actually able to capture historical operations pretty well. Clear Lake, this is being operated by a Yolo County Flood Control and Water Conservation District to irrigate large areas within Yolo County. Yolo County. There's a couple of decrees that constrain operation of Clear Lake, which are implemented in the model. So with the combination of, I think, using historical inflow data, using constraints on reservoir elevations, and a reasonably good match of diversions, we get a very good match of, or a very good simulation of Clear Lake. The district owns another reservoir, Indian Valley Reservoir, on the North Fork of Cache Creek. Now you can see that there's a problem with the simulation. SacWAM is holding on to storage, and it's doing this because the downstream demands are being met fully from, or almost fully from, Clear Lake, where the historical record shows that not to be true, and the district needs to make releases from Indian Valley to meet their agricultural demands. We believe, since we have a good match with diversions, we believe this is being caused by seepage losses in Cache Creek above the point of diversion, which are currently not included in the model. So those seepage losses would require greater releases from Clear Lake and Indian Valley Reservoir to meet the irrigation demand. On Cache Creek, we place the stream groundwater interaction below the point of diversion on lower Cache Creek, and probably what we should do is introduce another stream groundwater interaction, say somewhere near Rumsey. Lake Berryessa, this is so good I actually had to check it twice. I was convinced that we were mixed, simulated in historical data. It's probably a little better. I mean, it's not as good as it looks in that we have 1.6 million acre feet of storage, and we've got so much carryover storage compared to the annual demands on the reservoir that even if our releases were different by 20, 30,000 acre feet, you wouldn't see them at this scale. But in any case, we seem to be doing a good job of simulating flows on Pewter Creek. New Bullards Bar, so a facility owned and operated by Yuba County Water Agency on the North Fork of the Yuba River. This proved much harder to get a good simulation or a good match. We're getting the overall shape. We're getting the sort of typically the right amount of drawdown and refill. There are a lot of things that happened on the lower Yuba River. So remember, we're simulating existing conditions, existing flow requirements on the lower Yuba River, and we're comparing that to historical data. Well, as part of the lower Yuba River Accord, those flow requirements were changed by the state board. So the model is operating to a different set of flow requirements. And then additionally, we don't include water transfers, and in several years those have had a significant effect on operations by the district. I think this is the last one. This is Campfire West on the Bear River, and releases for Campfire West Irrigation District and South Sutter. Again, there are some years, typically in the last 7 or 8 years of simulation, we seem to be capturing the refill and drawn down. The first 10 years in the 1990s, we're doing less well. And I don't know whether that was due to changes in water supply to the district. They sometimes buy additional water from Nevada Irrigation District, but maybe something that we need to have another look at. Oh, I threw this in as well. This is Jenkinson Lake, so this is El Dorado's reservoir. Used to belong to the CVP. If you look at the period after the 93 drought has ended, we seem to be doing a very good job. We don't simulate what actually happened during the 6-year drought. So we may need to look again at carryover storage rules under extended drought. Pardee and Comanche was another difficult set of reservoirs to simulate. This is the combined storage in those two reservoirs. There are PG&E reservoirs upstream that we dynamically simulate. Some of the flood control space can be transferred from Pardee and Comanche to those upstream reservoirs. East Bay mud demands have changed over the period of simulation, or over these 20 years. Freeports come online, so there have been changes in their deficiencies they impose on their customers. I think the main reason for these differences are the very significant groundwater losses on the lower Mokelumne River, which are very dependent on flow. And I think those are driving these differences. We did also compare SacWAM to East Bay Mud's model, East Bay Mud Sim, and the comparison is much better, much in tighter agreement. New Hogan Reservoir, so this is operated by Stockton East during the summer to meet their agricultural and municipal demands on the lower Calaveras River. We have the right overall pattern. I mean, you can see that the reservoir is providing over-the-year storage in the dry periods, and the reservoir is being gradually drawn down over extended years. In one drawdown period, we're a little too aggressive, and in another one, we're not aggressive enough. But we are capturing the overall shape, I would argue, of the annual drawdown and refill, and then the longer term drawdown over a period of years. So there are, I think in the documentation, you'll find more examples of comparisons between the model and historical data, more comparisons with delivery data and flows at various gauges throughout the model domain. Although there remains to be remains areas that need our attention. I think you'll see that we're doing both a reasonable job in comparison with calcium 2. We're seeing flows of the order of 3% difference, and with the recent historical data, albeit that it's hard to capture everything that's gone on historically without a detailed knowledge of district operations and involvement of those particular districts. So it's 5 to 12. You've probably got questions, but they're probably being trumped by a desire to head out for lunch. So why don't we have about 5-10 minutes of questions and then adjourn for lunch? Do we know when we want folks back after lunch? Okay, so we're giving you an hour for lunch. So maybe if we have about 5-10 minutes of questions. Okay, there's our microphone guy.
I look at your outcome. When I look at CBP, we have more storage than housing. We have more export than housing. We have more outflow than housing. That means, to me, if you look at the overall system, your hydrology wise.
Yeah, we do. So we have a.
Helpful validation of those.
So I would agree. We've identified the problem in the Upper Feather River watershed. We haven't had time to fix it. So in terms of inflows to Oroville and flows in the high flow channel, I believe that with a few model refinements will be something very much closer to calcium 2. In terms of inflows to Delta, you're right, we do have more inflows. We do have more exports and outflow. That's being caused by two components. I believe calcium 2 doesn't include Dry Creek, which is tributary to the McCollamy. So we need to chase that down. That's probably about 100,000 acre feet of difference. And then the other thing is to really scrutinize our assumptions of rainfall runoff in those ungauged areas. Because if we look at Freeport, the hydrology is very, very similar. So the differences are stemming from these ungauged areas. And we've identified that, and we certainly need to be able to justify or validate our rainfall runoff assumptions by going back to gauge data that existed in the 70s and 80s and making sure that it's consistent with those older gauge data. So that's on our to-do list, and I can't talk for the State Water Board, but I would agree. I mean, you don't want a model that suggests there's more water in the system than there really is. Sorry, just perhaps one last point. We did introduce a correction that can be turned on and off. If that correction is turned on, it adjusts the SacWAM hydrology to that of calcium 2, so that the two models have the same accretion depletion in the valley floor. So if you wanted to run the model in a mode that it would more closely mimic the calcium 2 hydrology, then that capability is in the model. And we did that as part of the vetting of CVP, SWP operations. We wanted to say, when we see these differences, are they being driven by hydrology or are they being driven by model logic?
I have one comment. I think it's good.
Oh, thanks.
I think it's good to compare model results with historical data as you did for storage and delivery. But also, I think it would be good to compare in-stream flow, your model output, and with historical data.
So yeah, so we have.
Okay.
I assume that after about 30 slides, you might be bored of looking at comparisons. So we have gone down, so for example, down the Sacramento River. We've looked at Keswick, Benbridge, Butte City, Wilkins-Slough, Verona, Freeport, Bypass at Woodland. I mean, we've gone, I think Chuck said that we've got well over 100 flow gauges in the model. And, that's part of the very detailed validation to look what was happening over a 10-year, 20-year period and really make sure that we've captured both hydrology and operations and that our depletion from the system through agricultural water use is reasonably accurate or at least consistent with the historical data. Yes, everybody does want to go for lunch.
We'll reconvene. Those of you going to be going to the afternoon session, we'll reconvene at around 1 o'clock in conference room 550. Please don't forget to exchange your first and second floor badges for a badge that'll get you up to the 5th floor. We will have staff downstairs to check you in and give you the new badge and escort you up to the 5th floor.